Edward Brown glanced at the clock with disgust, which showed 8 in the evening. The parties would start soon, depriving him of peace once again. Damn summer season, when all the spoiled youth gatherings migrated here, to Silverfall, population 5,000, the nearest major city 3 hours away by car. The local scenery was very picturesque. 2 pristine lakes, forests all around. Perhaps it was precisely this that attracted the youth. To organize swims and picnics, stir up the water, break branches in the forest, and wander in a small cave labyrinth. Without fail, several times a season, some of these drunken groups would venture there, and his buddies would start calling the sheriff in drunken panic to urgently locate the missing. Sheriff of Silverfall was Edward Brown. He would come, walk into the cave, drag out the missing girl or boy, return them to their friends, and issue fines for fires in unauthorized places, damage to the forest, and anything else his imagination could conjure up. The youth paid up promptly after Edward called their father's lawyers a couple of times and filed claims. Silverfall, named because the river on which it stood carried a silvery foam at its founding, making it appear tinted by moonlight, was a city almost peaceful and quiet. The residents lived by serving the rich, whose mansions dotted the surrounding area. Probably from above, the city looked like Saturn, a small cluster of neat houses and a ring of opulent estates. In summer, the youth would come. In autumn, the older generation in winter life would slightly calm down. Only a few winter scenery enthusiasts would have fun here. In spring, Silverfall was left to its own devices, stocking up on everything for the upcoming seasons. "Hey, Edward!" The door slammed. The sheriff's assistant, George Raven, a handsome lad of about 20, barged in. "I brought you your favorite cinnamon rolls. What's new?" Same old, same old. Old Tom was causing trouble again. Sent him to sleep it off in the cell." "Yeah, his wife definitely won't reach him in the cell." George chuckled. The JJs, as they were called in Silverfall, were more for show that there was law and order even in such remote places. There were no crimes more serious than Old Tom stealing a loaf of bread while drunk. Watching over the youth, escorting the tipsy to sleep it off in the station, and patrolling the mansions to make sure everything was in order. That was Edward's entire list of duties. The latter was suggested by the Carlyle family, who were not very keen on paying for expensive security systems that were useless here. "Sheriff, just come by occasionally and make sure the wind doesn't break any windows or something like that." Edward agreed. They paid generously, and all that was needed was to drive up to the mansion, walk around it, jiggle every door, and drive back. Once had to chase away a couple of wolves from the estate grounds, but nothing else interesting happened. Although one more time had to run around, driving away a bear. "There's a party planned at the McLarens tonight." George looked dreamily at his watch. "They always have such women." "You're on duty," Edward lazily reminded him, not moving his legs from the table. "And you have someone to frolic with, you disgusting sodomite." George wasn't offended, just sighed even more deeply. "Annie went to the mainland, said we need to bring more dishes to the bar." Everyone in Silverfall knew that the sheriff's assistant lived with the proprietress of one of the 3 bars, but they all pretended not to know. It wasn't customary here to pry into someone else's personal life until it started to defy the law. For the same reason, nobody asked about the personal life of Sheriff Brown himself. "Maybe we should head over there, check out what's going on. Perhaps there are some girls there who are right up your alley." Edward showed the assistant his middle finger, pulled his hat lower, slouched in his chair. Girls. He didn't argue. Sometimes among the visiting youth, there were quite attractive beauties with enticingly tight miniskirts, ample bosoms, long legs, and intoxicated quite uninhibited. They were willing to frolic in bed with a handsome law enforcer. However, Edward wasn't interested in them. Are you still searching for your princess? George teased. Why don't you take notice of Megan? We could go on double dates and all. Megan, the sharp-tongued waitress from Annie's bar, with her dyed blue and chunkily cut hair and lip piercing, didn't appeal to Edward precisely because of her promiscuity. Edward didn't take offense at his assistant, understanding that he sincerely cared for his boss. George came here 5 years ago, a skinny lad in a brand-new uniform with a dream of becoming a policeman. He begged for a transfer away from his family. When they sent him to Silverfall, they said they didn't know whether to pity him or rejoice. At first, he was afraid of Edward to the point of stuttering. This 30-year-old, 6-foot warrior simply towered over him with his gaze. In the evenings, he would often sit at Annie's bar, trying to escape the memories of how the boss looked down on him during the day, probably dreaming of getting rid of him as soon as possible. It was there, in the dimly lit bar, that George's personal life with the attractive bar owner Annie began to take shape. "Do up your collar, the love bites are showing," Edward said one morning. "And tell Annie to set the alarm clock half an hour earlier." But George decided to hide under the table. "You're covered in her perfume. You need to wake up earlier. And now go home, take a shower, and wash off that stench of skunk in a chamomile field." George fled, took a shower, scrubbed the smell of someone else's perfume off himself for a long time, sobbing, not understanding why. When he returned, a package of men's cologne chosen by Edward awaited him. "Since I have to put up with you, you'll use this." George didn't object. He liked the scent. Annie also approved of the sheriff's choice. That's how they existed, peacefully and sometimes joyfully. George straightened up, shrugged his shoulders, bulked up, grew out of the skinny, blonde-haired gasper in a uniform into a neatly fitted, handsome fellow, a favorite of old ladies and cats, endlessly adoring Sheriff Edward. And now they both lingered in the sheriff's office, each occupied with their own business. Edward dozed. George folded some figure from a sheet of paper that happened to be lying around. On the wall, a poster with Edward's photograph fluttered rhythmically in the draft from the fan, bearing the inscription, "Sheriff Brown, the heart of Silverfall, prepared for the upcoming sheriff elections." The elections were purely nominal. There was only one candidate for the position, but the townsfolk enthusiastically put up posters, and Edward had rehearsed his speech 3 times already. The small town where nobody wanted to go even for the clean air, amazing pastries, and beautiful forest walks, loved their sheriff and had no intention of replacing him. Outside, the rumble of a motorcycle was heard, followed by the click-clack of heels on the path to the door. Edward kicked his legs off the table, straightened up. George swept the unfinished figure into the desk drawer and straightened up as well. The door opened. "Oh," was all George managed to say as he looked at the newcomer. She was only slightly shorter than Edward, but more elegantly built. Yet the danger emanated from her for miles, just like from Sheriff Brown. A fatal brunette, whom one could easily imagine in a casino, clad in a bright crimson dress, with James Bond standing next to her, getting lost against her background. "Sheriff Brown?" She glanced attentively at Edward. He rose, nodding. "And you?" "Alice Siver. I was told I'd have problems if I hunted in your forest without checking in." "I don't know who told you that, but they're right. And who did you decide to hunt here?" Alice unbuttoned her jacket, turned half away, showing the badge attached. George frowned. A federal agent. What did she want here? "We have an escaped prisoner. There is a suspicion that he may appear here." "I wasn't informed," Edward frowned. "It's a covert operation. I was strongly advised not to disclose it to you, but I have my own methods of work." which don't include evading an enraged local sheriff who might not like me hanging around. We have a special criminal on the loose. He's a maniac, obsessed with killing simply because he enjoys it. How did this happen? The most ridiculous accident. The car skidded, flipped over. When the agents got out, the criminal was gone. We combed the forest, but it was pointless. He's excellent at evading pursuits in such places. He will try to find people, I have no doubt about it. Crowds attract him. Edward pondered everything said for a few minutes, then decisively spoke up. Let's go together. We have plenty of places here where he could hide, but today there's only one where he might show up. There's a party tonight at the territory of one wealthy mansion. If your maniac decides to start killing, he'll come there. Alice was about to say something, then changed her mind and nodded. Your help will be invaluable, Sheriff. What does your maniac look like? He looks like a very tall teenager. He's only 15, Sheriff. That's why the secrecy. We wouldn't want the papers to write that a kid is killing left and right. He's blonde with blue eyes, looks like an angel, you could say. He was wearing dark clothes when he escaped. Here's his photo. Alice handed over a rectangular piece of cardboard. George approached, looked at the photo, committing it to memory. Handsome. It's hard to believe such a kid could be a killer, he thought. He looks like a straight-A student and his parents' pride. George voiced his thoughts. He killed his parents first, Alice said grimly. Well, let's move, George. You'll get to the McLaren party. Change your clothes. You're invited there tonight. If I don't show up to check on them, it'll be strange, so I'll drop by and give them a good scolding. Edward flexed his fingers. And you two will just join the dancers. I'll inspect the forest around. Maybe we'll see something. Alice agreed, then suddenly said, Sheriff, be careful. The kid is very cunning. I can't tell you everything, but he's very special and can resort to various tricks to deceive his victims. Edward looked at her, smirked, and walked out of the station. And where are you staying? I can take you to the hotel. It's small, only 2 rooms, but clean. George scratched his head. No time. Let's go like this. We'll stop by your place. You'll change. And I'll freshen up too, if you don't mind, officer. George didn't mind. Annie was still absent, so she wouldn't object to a federal agent changing at their place. Alice parked her motorcycle in the lot behind the office, so they had to walk. Shower? Food? George tried his best to be hospitable. A shower, please, and I wouldn't mind some tea. Alice clearly noticed that 2 people lived in the house, but didn't show any signs of surprise, took a shower, put on George's robe, and drank some tea. Everything was so peaceful, as if they were not about to catch some maniac, but just going out for entertainment. George shook his head, chasing away that feeling. They had to work to make Edward happy. Let's go. It's time. The party has already started. Soon everyone will be drunk enough. Alice stood up. George rushed to change into civilian clothes. Jeans, a t-shirt, that's it. A fairly neutral option. When he saw Alice, the gift of speech disappeared somewhere. It was unclear where the agent hid the short black dress, but she managed to do it. And now she was simply stunning. They'll take me for one of their own at the party, right? Yes, absolutely, said an embarrassed George. Then let's go. The music from the mansion resonated far and wide, sometimes drowning out the shouts and laughter. The young people were carelessly enjoying themselves, unaware of the danger creeping towards them. Those who noticed them glanced indifferently, hardly surprised. It was unlikely that everyone here knew each other by sight, and George and Alice looked perfectly at home. And where shall we start? There are many rooms here, George shouted over the music. Follow me. Alice led him away from the house towards the forest, surveying the building and shaking her head. Too much light. All right. Here's what we'll do." At that moment, Alice froze, her eyes taking on a strange, almost golden hue. George watched in astonishment, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, a vision unfolded before his eyes, sending shivers down his spine. Alice's skin began to change, darkening, and her body contorted into unimaginable forms. Thick fur emerged beneath her clothes, covering her entire body, while her hands and feet morphed into animalistic shapes. Her face elongated, forming a snout with sharp, razor-like teeth and gleaming eyes in the darkness. George recoiled, his eyes widening in horror. Alice, now in the form of a powerful werewolf, growled lowly, displaying her long fangs. Her hands turned into claws, and muscular, powerful legs sprouted from her back, designed for running and hunting. Even her voice changed, becoming deep and animalistic as she spoke with a threat. "I'm truly sorry, but I'm hungry." At that moment, as Alice in her werewolf form was about to make her next move, a gunshot rang out. George saw something red splatter on his white shirt, then felt heat and pain. Heat from the sensation of something flowing over him, and pain from Alice, falling, digging her claws into his arm. Nearby stood Edward with a shotgun. "You blew her skull off," George noted, still frightened. "Yeah," said the sheriff. "You blew her skull off right onto me." "Yeah, you're right." "What the hell is going on?" asked George. "Huh? What? Isn't it obvious?" "I think you figured it out," said Edward, reloading the shotgun. George stepped back behind some bushes, deciding that after such an experience, vomiting was in order. It didn't work, as some strange and dull indifference overcame him. He had just been attacked by a federal agent in the guise of a werewolf. Who would believe him and not think he was crazy? And then Alice's body began to change back, as if death itself had lifted the curse from her, returning her to her human form. The fur covering her body disappeared before his eyes, giving way to returning smooth skin. Claws retracted back into fingers, and the snout gave way to her normal facial features. All the animalistic attributes that had filled George with horror dissolved, leaving behind only the body of a young woman with a peaceful and almost innocent expression on her face. George stared at her, unable to believe his eyes. All the signs of a werewolf, everything that had made her so threatening just moments ago, had vanished as if they had never existed. All that remained was Alice, lying lifelessly on the ground, her eyes devoid of the life that had sparkled there just moments before. "Are you feeling any better?" asked the sheriff, approaching a little closer. "I don't know. I think I need to change clothes, wash up, and have a drink. Definitely a drink first, and damn it, why are you so calm?" "Well, if I'm honest, my hands are shaking," Edward admitted, raising his hands. "I'm seeing this for the first time too, but there's a rational explanation for everything. Maybe she's a mutant or someone's experiment, I don't know. Either way, you're alive, and that's good." "And now what? And how did you know she would attack me?" "You think they don't send us lists of escaped maniacs? I got her photo 3 days ago and was warned that she was heading our way. They just didn't tell me she was, a werewolf." "And you kept quiet about her being a maniac?" George was offended. "I needed your natural reaction so as not to scare her off. I didn't know she was a monster, sorry," Edward said, lowering his head and examining Alice's body. "Anyway, let's go. We need to get a tarp, wrap up the body. The feds are already on their way, this time for real." "And the photo of that boy she showed?" "Her first victim, probably. I don't know." Edward put away the shotgun. "All right, let's go. There's a stream nearby. Get yourself cleaned up." On the shore, George stripped naked and went into the stream. The water gradually turned from silver to red from the blood being washed away. The jeans are intact. The shirt will need some washing. Go to the party. I won't tell Annie if you decide to fully relax tonight. Edward looked up at the sky. As for me, I'll wait for the feds. Tell them everything, then go to the bar, order some drinks, maybe get a closer look at Megan. You want to tell them everything? Even that she's a werewolf? I think they already know, just didn't tell us, damn feds. Edward spat demonstratively. Yeah, said George. You know, I don't want to go to the party. Let's wait for them together, and then to the bar. Maybe Annie will show up while we wait. We'll have a double date or something. Chapter 2. The quiet town of Silverfall. 5,000 residents, 3 bars, a hotel, a church, a bakery, a mechanic, and 2 policemen, Ed and George. Over Silverfall, dark and heavy clouds gathered, full of water ready to pour down and properly clean the houses, roads, and drive the 2 rowdy youth indoors, where their cries wouldn't be heard as much. Edward watched with some malice from the top of the hill through binoculars as drinks and snacks were hastily collected, placed outdoors, as the girls screamed, jumping out of the pool, hurrying to take shelter under the roof. The lips of the guys were filled with sophisticated curses, but no amount of money from all the partygoers could resist the elements, even when pooled together. Well, that's just great. I should find somewhere to hunker down, muttered the sheriff to himself. Somewhere meant either heading to the sheriff's office and waiting out the rain there, sorting through paperwork for the 100th time and rearranging pencils, or going home, lying down to sleep, and forgetting about everything. Although, there was also the option of going to Annie's bar, sitting at a table by the window overlooking the lake, and watching the murky veil over the water while sipping cold beer. Plus, there was a door nearby that Annie had installed specifically for a quick exit to help anyone drowning foolishly attempting to swim in the lake. There had been a couple of incidents where the sheriff had smashed the window with a chair, and fishermen would come through that door from the lake for a warming drink. Kids would run in for towels, and through the bar, you could quickly get to swim in the summer noon. No one would be swimming in this weather for sure. The storm intended to unleash its fury as if seeking revenge for 2 weeks of suffocating heat. But sitting with a beer and watching the lake was just perfect. Edward headed down, deciding that the rich kids could take care of themselves, and he was starting his day off. To hell with the office and home. It was useful to relax sometimes. Annie's bar stood in a pretty convenient location, close to home, close to the woods, with a summer veranda where you could fold up to sleep, and the gracious bar owner would always cover you with a spare blanket. Sheriff Brown, I've been waiting for you, Annie said, beaming at Edward as if they hadn't seen each other for a couple of years, rushing to hand him a misted bottle of beer, opened right in Edward's hands. The bar owner was generally a very friendly and hospitable person, always ready to help, which was why she was loved in the town. You've been waiting for me? Edward graciously accepted the beer, took a sip. Yes, I went out for more dishes yesterday, brought back a new waitress too. I want to introduce you. Arlene, come here. Edward turned his gaze to the approaching girl, noting that she was quite lovely, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and as cute as a porcelain doll. The blue uniform suited her very well. Arlene Maddox, my new assistant. Edward Brown, sheriff of our town, Silverfall. Arlene smiled awkwardly and blushed, mumbling something about being very pleased to meet him. Edward smiled and headed to his table, which was already taken by the most brazen and carefree individuals. George? George stopped his meticulous scraping of dried fish skin and smiled sunnily. Hey, Ed. The weather's horrible, isn't it? Yeah, seems normal. Want a beer? Of course, you're asking too. Annie brought a couple of barrels of dark. We'll tap them now if you don't prefer these bottled swill. I like bottled, Edward growled fiercely. Something crashed nearby, and Edward looked in that direction, seeing Arlene picking up shards of a coffee cup from the floor with trembling hands. "Don't startle the girl!" George protested, hurrying to help. "Ma'am, let me, you'll cut yourself like this. Megan, fetch a broom." The fair-haired waitress appeared, glanced down at Arlene, hissed something, and threw her a broom and dustpan. Edward squinted, sensing a conflict brewing. Why did Annie need a second waitress when she was doing just fine? What happened? The bar owner hurried to the scene. "Ask your new protégé here who just smashed the remnants of her pitiful tip." Megan grumbled unfriendly and left, clattering her heels. Arlene bit her lip and began to sweep up the shards even faster. Megan went to make new coffee for old Tom, who was trying to sober up before returning home. Luckily for Arlene, the old man didn't react to what had happened, snoring with his head drooping onto his chest. "Is everything okay?" Edward asked George upon his return. "Who is this girl anyway?" "Annie's thinking of expanding the bar," George whispered, sharing a great secret. "Linda Mirkwood decided to move out, selling her place to Annie, so now we'll only have one bar in the whole town of Silverfall. Wait, what about the Forest Cabin?" The Forest Cabin, serving as a refuge for rare tourists, decorated to resemble that very habitat it was named after, posed a worthy competition to its two rivals. Edward didn't favor that establishment too much. It was cramped in there, and the beer they served was quite poor. They decided to change their line of business. Now there will be a hotel and all that. Meister Carlyle has invested money in their development. Silverfall is gradually coming to life. Tourist brochures, trails, and all that jazz. Our office will gradually expand its staff. "Idiots would expand their brains," Edward said angrily. Arlene flinched again and dropped the tray, fortunately empty, earning another unfriendly look from Megan, who was just seeing Tom off, handing him over to his wife, who was already preparing for a bloody reckoning. "Ed, you have to consider the prospects." George bounced on his chair. "This bar will remain for locals, and the second one, we'll fix it up and it'll be a paradise for tourists. Judith's Bakery will supply pastries to the Forest Cabin and our second bar. Hunters and fishermen will also contribute to Silverfall's benefit. I bet there'll be crowds of weirdos in Hawaiian shirts wandering around my town, snapping photos left and right. Say goodbye to Silverfall, George, to our quiet and lovely Silverfall where doors were never locked and kids played in the streets all night long. The crime rate will skyrocket, we'll be overwhelmed, and don't even mention expansion to me." Annie placed a tray with a bottle of beer for Edward and a mug of the same drink for George in front of them, silently asking for permission to sit. "Did George already tell you about what's going on here?" "Yes, and I don't approve of it. I'll talk to Carlyle. His idea is simply awful. It will kill Silverfall." "Ed, face the truth. Without financial injections, the city will simply die out, and the youth isn't exactly rushing back. And if this becomes a tourist town, there will be prospects. New people will come here. That's what I'm afraid of. They'll give you rookies. You'll train them thoroughly," Annie continued. "Don't you want that? I think you're already tired of George, and this way there will be new acquaintances. You won't have to go on all the calls yourself. I had 3 calls this month. 2 of them were kids asking to chase a fox from the yard. And one time those idiots from the Cheesebird estate thought there was a criminal in a fur coat in the pool. In the middle of summer, they have a criminal in a fur coat who turned out to be Mr. Cheesebird's overheated mastiff. Did I need to read him his rights and arrest him? And I'm perfectly fine with fishing mastiffs out of the pool and chasing foxes into the woods with a stick. You just need more beer, George decided. And salted nuts, Ed added. After the 5th bottle, the sheriff began to think that the idea of attracting tourists to the city was not without its charm. He could send new subordinates on trips to the youth, which had gone wild to the point where they dragged George to drink with them, and the McLarens had even greeted Ed with a case of beer with a postcard, "To the kindest sheriff of our and 3 neighboring states." Just think, Ed, how great it will be. A couple of travel agents have already come to town. George's eyes sparkled as he spilled this news. One was in high heels, broke a heel, burst into tears, and left. But the second one put on the hunting boots she had begged from Delilah under her business suit and walked along the trail in this form. "And where was I all this time?" Ed wondered. "You slept in the office under the fan and caught foxes." George chuckled unsteadily. "And you also wrote reports to send, drank beer, and went into the woods to search for lost youth. You have me for public relations. That should be enough. More beer, Ed?" "Enough for today." A lightning bolt flashed outside, occupying half the sky, illuminating everything around. George laid his hand on Ed's shoulder in a gesture of silent support. He already knew that this sheriff didn't like lightning. Not afraid. No, just didn't like it. It was too reminiscent of another source of light that hung over positions when squads of soldiers marched to the enemy camp. Ed's military past had been kind to him. No injuries, no psychological trauma. He just didn't like lightning. Annie turned off the lights in the bar, brought candles to the neighboring table where Arlen and Megan sat, then brought another candle floating in a glass bowl, placing it on the table for Ed and George, and sat down next to George. And just in time, a roll of thunder made everyone duck, although in the closed, warm room, there was certainly no threat to anyone. "Beautiful," Ed finally said, watching the rain pour down the window. The phone rang behind the bar. Annie went there, listened. "Yes, the sheriff will be here soon. Ed, something's happened at the Lindberghs. Everyone's screaming. Everyone's in such a panic, as if a maniac is chasing them." "With an axe or a knife?" Ed grumbled discontentedly, already regretting that all incoming visitors were given 3 phone numbers to reach the sheriff: his office, his home, and Annie's bar. Help could definitely be obtained at one of these 3 places. Someone named Ed was definitely in one of them. Or Annie herself would come if it was found out that a heater had fallen into the pool and needed to be retrieved because everyone was scared. "They were screaming as if there were 2 axes there," Annie said, looking out the window. "I can give you a raincoat." "It won't help me?" Ed stood up straight. "Give me the keys to your pickup and open the door. It's standing around the corner. Will you make it?" Annie tossed him the keys, then opened the door of the bar, letting in a stream of water. Ed nodded and dashed forward, slightly tilting his head, throwing himself into the downpour that engulfed his figure. It was still dark, as if night had suddenly descended, so all that was left was to guess how the sheriff was doing out there. The headlights barely cut through the darkness and water, and Ed wasn't sure anymore if he missed the turn to the Lindberghs. But ahead, he finally glimpsed a pristine white mansion in the classical style of the 18th century. The hall was crowded, the flashlight beam catching terrified faces. "What happened here?" "The lights went out," one of the girls whimpered. "And Matt's gone." "Matt?" Ed patiently repeated. "The power's out because of the storm. Calm down. There must be backup generators for this." "Where are they?" "In the basement," someone mumbled uncertainly. "And where's the basement?" The crowd led Edward to the desired door. He mentally cursed the rich fools. His forehead was illuminated by the faint light of the flashlight. He cautiously cracked open the door to the basement. Outside, a real storm was raging, and as soon as he stepped onto the first step, lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating everything around with a bright, blinding light. Thunder rumbled so close it seemed as if the very earth beneath his feet was trembling in response. Edward paused for a moment, listening to the sounds coming from the depths of the basement. Only water droplets, seeping through the old roof, monotonously tapped against the cold concrete. And the wind howled somewhere at the very foundations of the house, as if trying to find a way in. The sheriff sighed and continued his descent, every step echoing heavily. The flashlight in his hands constantly struggled to break free from the sudden gusts of wind seeping through the cracks, and Edward held it tightly to avoid losing the only source of light. The air in the basement was cold and damp, each breath filling his lungs with a piercing chill. As he reached the bottom, a space filled with old things and furniture, collecting dust for years, opened up before him. Edward moved slowly between the scattered boxes and old, forgotten toys on the floor, which seemed alive in the flashlight's beam. Their shadows danced on the walls, creating an illusion of movement, making the sheriff glance over his shoulder. Suddenly, deep in the darkness, he caught a barely audible rustle. Edward froze, directing the flashlight beam in that direction. The light revealed only emptiness between the old wardrobes and abandoned items. But the rustle persisted, now seeming to surround him from all sides. A shiver ran down the sheriff's spine. And then, from the darkness before him, like a ghost from the past, a figure appeared, swaying and barely able to stand. It was Matt. He was so drunk that his breath could be felt from a distance. Matt breathed heavily and muttered something incoherent, trying to focus his gaze on Edward, but his eyes slid past, not meeting the sheriff's gaze. "Take him away," Edward grumbled irritably, handing the snoring body over to the hands of his family members. "I'll turn on the light." And he descended back into the basement. They looked at him upon his return with such enthusiasm, as if he had disarmed a couple of armed-to-the-teeth criminals right before their eyes, rather than simply turning on the generators. "I hope you'll quietly disperse to your rooms, and there won't be any more incidents." He was assured that everything would be fine. Everyone would be sent to their rooms, and until morning, everyone would behave very quietly. Returning to the bar was difficult. The car slid through streams of mud, seemingly eager to veer off somewhere, but no steering wheel had ever slipped from Sheriff Brown's confident hands. So soon the pickup stopped at the bar, still illuminated by candles. "What happened there?" Annie inquired. "The power went out." Edward shrugged off his jacket, hanging it by the entrance, where it immediately began to drip. The storm passed, moving somewhere further into the woods, and lightened up. The first residents emerged from their homes to assess the damage done to the town. In the bar, too, people started to trickle in, eager to have a couple of drinks and discuss the bad weather. Edward prepared to get back to work, and George joined him, deciding to check if any windows were shattered, if a tree had fallen on the patrol car, and if the office had flooded at all. "What do you think of the new waitress?" George inquired. "She's nice," Edward responded. "Just don't start. And she likes you." Edward grimaced in response, deciding to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Where did Annie even find her, do you know?" George was aware of everything happening in town. The story turned out to be simple and straightforward. A lonely girl, almost destitute, found herself abandoned somewhere on the road. Annie, a kind soul, picked her up when returning to town and couldn't bear to see her suffer. So the new waitress appeared in the bar. Arlen initially didn't want to go anywhere, but then agreed, succumbing to Annie's persuasion and assurances that she had no ulterior motives and wouldn't abandon her in the woods. The owner of the bar's business card and a joint photo with George finally melted Arlen's resistance. "She's kind of awkward," Edward remarked. "Just new, and Megan's trying too, causing mischief as she can." The paint got into her brain. She's convinced Annie is going to fire her. Idiot. Anyway, she's not listening to anything. Let her be. She'll come to her senses. By the way, she likes playing frisbee. Megan, of course, mocked her when Arlen mentioned it. And I understand her. All right, we're here. Fortunately, everything was fine in the office, so there was no need to spend much time inspecting. The next day, the sun had already dried up the mud, and the weather decided to remember that it was midsummer. It was almost night, and Edward grimaced, suffering from the heat. The old fan was barely coping with cooling the office. "It's even stuffier at night than during the day," George complained. "Let's go to the bar. It's cooler there." Edward had no objections. They raced almost neck and neck to the bar, dreaming of a gulp of cold water. Motorcycles stood near the bar, apparently. The next group of bikers passing through the country decided to turn into the town and rest. "Annie, we need—" Edward swung open the door and froze. Yes, the bikers were here. Or rather, they were no longer bikers. In the bar stood monsters. There was also Megan, looking at the werewolves with trembling hands. Arlene, who was smiling strangely, and Annie, lying against the wall holding her head. There was blood running between her fingers. There was no time to reach for weapons. They had to act the old-fashioned way. Edward, without hesitation, struck the first werewolf with a chair he grabbed on the go. The chair shattered into pieces, but he managed to knock the creature down. The second werewolf, leaping at Edward, was thrown back thanks to George's accurate shot. At that moment, the first werewolf decided to attack the sheriff and quickly regretted his decision when Edward shot him straight in the mouth. But before Edward could reload his weapon, Arlen, with a piercing scream, lunged at him. Her claws cruelly pierced his flesh as she transformed into a werewolf. The sheriff lost his balance and crashed onto the table in front of him, trying to push away the enraged waitress, but she grabbed him firmly. "You bastard, you killed Alice," she screamed. "You killed my sister and brothers, I'll tear you apart." At the critical moment, a shot rang out. Edward felt Arlen go limp and fall to the floor. The sheriff turned and saw George, reloading his weapon. "Now we're even," he said solemnly. "Well done," muttered Edward, backing away from Arlen's body, which was already returning to its human form. Then everything followed a familiar script. They called in the federal agents and detailed the events of the night. With dissatisfaction and profanity, they expressed their gratitude to the feds for not warning them that the werewolf named Alice had an entire family pack of werewolves. After the report was filed, they headed back to the bar, which was now safe. "Quite a crazy night," remarked George. "And it'll be like this every time if Silver Fall opens up to tourists?" Edward couldn't resist a jab. "By the way, Annie, what's up with your second bar?" "The sign's already made. You can take a look yourself. I'll bring it over. Just keep the pistol away." Edward glanced interestedly at Annie, then removed the holster with the pistol and handed it to George. Annie chuckled and went off somewhere, returning with a sign depicting a man with a shotgun in one hand and a beer mug in the other, glaring menacingly. The sign above his head read, "Edward's Wrath." Quiet Silverfall, woods, 2 lakes, a hotel, a restaurant, and a new bar named after the local sheriff.